Is being woke good or bad? Well, it depends greatly on what you mean by woke. Now, I've scoured the internet for a consistent definition of woke, and what I found was that perception of what the term stands for is very clearly demarcated along political affiliation. Left leaning people tend toward an approximation of the first definition in Webster's dictionary, which is, quote, aware of and actively attentive to important societal facts and issues, especially issues of racial and social justice, unquote. While right-leaning people tend toward the second definition, quote, politically liberal or progressive, as in matters of racial and social justice, especially in a way that is considered unreasonable or extreme, unquote. Now, it originally meant the first definition, but throughout recent political discourse, the term was co-opted and turned into the second definition in order to disparage. Throughout most of my search, I found that people using it to disparage varied greatly in how they tried to define it. They weren't very consistent. Some had difficulty defining it at all.
Would you mind defining woke? Because it's come up a couple times, and I just want to make sure we're on the same page.
So, I mean, woke is sort of the idea that
Some defined it as assigning viewpoints to entire groups.
It's a basis for madness. When people say the gay community, who are you talking about? It's like, women think this. Oh, really? 50% of the species all agree on something. Blacks say this. Really?
And some defined it as the perfect opposite, being restricted from assigning viewpoints to entire groups.
People always ask, what is the definition of woke? Well, the definition of woke, as I mentioned in the book, is the making sacred of historically marginalized race, gender, and sexual identity groups. That's it.
Now, that last clip is very interesting to me because he admits something I don't think he intended to admit. And the word sacred is what led him into his own trap. He talks about historically marginalized groups, such as gender, race, and sexual orientation, as being sacred. In other words, unassailable, unable to blaspheme against. But here's my question. What legitimate criticism or negative statement can be levied at an entire race or an entire gender or an entire sexual orientation? Now, if someone said, quote, the problem with black people is ABC, or the problem with women is XYZ, wouldn't we immediately recognize that as racists or sexist because you're shoehorning everyone of those groups into a box of problems based on their immutable characteristics? How do you correct immutable characteristics? Genocide? Eugenics? What? So, yes, we have decided as a society to not discriminate based on certain demographics like race, gender, and sexual orientation. Isn't that a good thing? Calling that sacred does not excuse bigotry, does it? And calling that woke doesn't make woke a bad thing, does it? Years ago, people would have described me as anti-woke because I openly expressed dislike of what some people would associate with wokeness today. But my dislike was rooted in a fundamental misunderstanding. It took me too long to realize this, but my dislike was not for a specific group of people, which is the same mistake that right-leaning people are making now. My dislike was for a specific set of traits that anybody of any group could possess. It's just that sometimes people are willing to overlook these traits if they're held by people of their own group. Typical tribalism. These are the traits: obsessive, easily offended, hypocritical, and lacking self-awareness. Now, these are often a package deal. I associated those traits with certain groups, rather than the more accurate approach of attributing them to the individuals who exhibited those traits. The truth is that someone who is woke might not have any of those traits, while someone who is intensely anti-woke could have every single one of them. But the right-wing media sphere is a juggernaut that searches for, outright invents, or focuses upon the most extreme, legit or not, and then elevates that, puts a spotlight on it as the norm. So people end up with a lopsided view of reality. And if you don't agree with them, then you are called a cuck, a simp, a beta, soy boy, and any one of a million other emasculating terms that works very well on insecure young men. They are experts at controlling the narrative. Now, when I was a kid, about once a month or so, I'd visit a relative of mine who was a pretty staunch feminist. And I remember one time when my brother and I were driving in the car with her, and somebody driving in front of us made her very frustrated. And eventually they turned without using a turn signal. And I never forgot what she said in response to that. She said, quote, "Men don't know how to use turn signals." That was very peculiar to me, even as a child. I remember that you couldn't even see the car's driver, couldn't even tell if they were a man or a woman. She just assumed. And she was making a disparaging statement about something I was going to become one day, a man. And that fact did not escape my young mind. She frequently made disparaging statements about men in general, and it made me wonder if one day she was going to hate me too. I wondered if it was only my existence as a child that made me acceptable to her. I didn't know. And what rubbed me the wrong way, which I could not quite express back then, was that she had those traits I disliked. She was obsessive, easily offended, hypocritical, and lacked self-awareness. Now, as a result, she did things that she did not like when men did them. Misogynistic men made assumptions about her because she was a woman, and so she did the same back to them. She became what she hated, and something I've constantly warned you against throughout the life of my channel. Hate nobody, or those you hate will shape you into what you will be. It made me feel toward her the same way I already felt toward religious people at an early age. Religious people aggravated me because they made assumptions about me based on the simple fact that I did not believe what they believed. They ascribed to me all sorts of ulterior motives, things that never even entered my thought process. Like I just wanted to sin, or that I hated God, or that I was rebelling, or that I just wanted to live by my own rules, or that I hated them, etc. And the list was endless, but none of that was true. And they were so easily offended. My mere existence as a non-believer offended them. How dare I disbelieve what they believed? I was 8 years old the first time I told someone that I did not believe God existed. This was before I even knew the word atheist. And the reason I remember it so well is because of the reaction I received. It was a classmate. We were both in the second grade at the time. His name was David, and I even remember his last name too, but I won't say it. It begins with a V. So David V mentioned something about God, and I told him that God is just another fairy tale, just like all the other fairy tales that the adults tell us. That's truly how I saw it at the time. And he told me that I'm going to burn in hell. And what struck me was that he looked happy about it. He was grinning when he said it. And I think that helped instill in me the idea that not everything that is claimed to be good really truthfully is good. That was one of the lessons that taught me about the inconsistencies of life. Here we had someone who was a Christian, who we were supposed to think of as good people, yet he was reveling in the idea of someone else's pain and suffering, my pain and suffering. And it wasn't like I was ever mean to him. He had no reason to hate me, yet he still seemed to like the idea of my torture. And that stuck with me. After that, it aggravated me when people used religion as a shortcut to tell if someone was a good person, or that their lack of religion was a way to tell that they're a bad person. I remember someone telling me that they knew my brother was a good person because they saw the Christian bumper sticker on his car. I couldn't put my finger on it yet, but there was a certain commonality among the people that aggravated me. I did not yet know that this type of person was not limited to any one ideology. They could really be anybody. It wasn't a trait inherent to feminism or religion, and I didn't really truly figure it out until around 2016, much later in life. That was when I started to truly understand that it was these traits that I disliked: obsessive, easily offended, hypocritical, and lacking self-awareness. And that was the real problem I had with my feminist relative and many of the religious people I argued with over the years. It wasn't their feminism, and it wasn't their religion. It was their specific behavior for which they alone are responsible. In order to learn that lesson, I had to witness a remarkable shift in the zeitgeist, and that happened in the mid-2010s. Now, at first, I was making the exact same mistake of attributing those characteristics to a specific group of people. What taught me the lesson was the reaction to them. During the years around 2014, we had a term for those people, which we called SJW, which stood for Social Justice Warrior. People don't usually use that term anymore because it has been fundamentally subsumed by the term woke. They're essentially synonymous now, though their etymology is a bit different. Back then, around a decade or so before this recording, it was popular to make fun of SJWs. I was essentially on the vanguard against wokeism back then. Now, a lot of people developed entire careers out of doing that. Nobody took it terribly seriously beyond comedic purposes, though. The comedy was very easy and in demand, so naturally it flourished. I made a cartoon that was doing great numbers and going viral. It was called If God Became an SJW. Now, when I realized the truth of what was really going on, I put that video on private so that it would not be seen anymore. I made a mistake by making that cartoon, and correcting that mistake was not pain-free, as that video was pretty lucrative. But I can't stand by something that I don't believe in just for the money. As a lot of you who are familiar with my work know, I no longer make videos like that, and I have not done it for a long time now. I've even been accused of being woke now, which is very funny to me. So what changed? See, a lot of people disliked SJWs for the same reason that I disliked religion, because we generalized the people in those groups based on the more extreme ones who seemed very obsessive, very hypocritical, lacked self-awareness, and were easily offended. And nobody likes walking on eggshells. Nobody likes their language being policed, like blasphemy, or to be lectured, like sermons, or to be accused of certain things just on the basis of immutable characteristics born into sin, like being a man or being white or straight, etc. To anti-SJWs, that seemed to be ironically racist and sexist. That fed into my belief that they were hypocritical and lacked self-awareness, the things that I disliked so much. So I was motivated to mock them. In hindsight, I know that many of them had valid concerns, but were perhaps expressed in ways that weren't very diplomatic and much more accusatory. To make sense of why I did not stay the course in an anti-woke direction, it would help to understand a little bit of the history involved. Much of the movement against the SJWs, and eventually the woke, as they're called now, can be exemplified in the massive pop culture backlash against a woman named Anita Sarkeesian and what she represented. She started a nonprofit organization called Feminist Frequency. She was a critic of modern media, like movies and video games, but rather than examining them from the perspective of technical competence or artistic value, like most critics, she evaluated them from a perspective of positive or negative cultural impact, usually in terms of whether or not the movie or video game was problematic in how it portrayed women or various minority groups, or even that they weren't portrayed at all, that they didn't have enough representation. And I think that she felt we as a society had become too accustomed and accepting of how these various demographics are treated in our media or left out altogether, which has an effect on our perceptions. And some of the things she criticized were pieces of media that we loved. And I think a lot of people felt personally attacked by that. We were being called guilty for liking things that she considered problematic. For example, she would criticize things like impractical armor for women in video games that was too skimpy, or the women were too sexualized, or the camera focused a bit too much on a woman's sexual characteristics, which was called the male gaze. And these were things that most guys liked, including myself. So it seems like the industry catered to guys for the most part. And she argued that it should cater to everyone. She gained traction in mainstream media too, and it was even reported that she started consulting in game development. And I think that scared a lot of people. But I think that she was welcomed as a consultant because naturally these companies wanted to broaden their audiences, which would make them more profitable. And she found some success too, and a lot of people claimed that it was not organic success. She was receiving a lot of funding for her work, and some of her most ardent detractors would point out that her work did not reflect the amount of funding she was receiving. Basically, it was an accusation of grifting before that term was very common. But I don't think it's accurate to call her a grifter because I think she was a true believer in her cause. Grifters, on the other hand, don't really care about the cause. The cause is just whatever is popular at the moment. Now, on a surface level, it doesn't really sound like there's anything wrong with any of that, right? But I was far from alone in thinking that something about the way it was executed seemed off. It rubbed me the wrong way, enough to the point where I also started criticizing SJWs. Now, at first, it was the obsessive nature of it that bothered me. It's one of the main things that bothered me about religion, too. I saw it as getting offended about every little thing, but not just merely getting offended about something you happened to see or hear. It seemed like it was a movement that sought out offense to point at, like they actively desired to be offended. For instance, if I were to behave the same way in terms of religion, my channel would look very different than it does now. My channel is critical of organized religion, but for me, it would be like instead of getting into religious doctrine itself, or instead of talking about the various ways religion is affecting our politics, it would be as if I watched movies and video games with an ear attentively waiting for someone to mention Christ, or to present themselves as a Christian, or to find someone in a movie wearing a cross, or praying, or anything like that, and then obsessively deconstructing it, how it's problematic, how there's no equal representation for atheists or other religions. It would be as if I would not be able to enjoy media that has Christian elements. But that's just not the case for me. I don't mind Christian elements in movies and games, but what if they portrayed atheists negatively or inaccurately? Maybe then I could empathize a little better with what Anita was doing, but I just didn't think of it that way. Regardless, shallow and seeking offense is how I perceived critical analysis by SJWs anyway. And I think other people perceived that as well. So it became a game to be offensive to them, to get their attention and then laugh at them for it, to actively seek to trigger them, as it was called. So it was a bit of a symbiosis for a while. They sought to be offended while others sought to offend them. And back then, the term "you mad brah" was popular. It was widely perceived that getting mad or getting offended meant that you lost the game, lost the debate. So even if you weren't mad or offended, it was a common tactic to portray you as such, as a shortcut to winning. And because the SJWs were always complaining about racism and sexism, a lot of people realized that making racist and sexist jokes was a great way to trigger them. Unfortunately, I think that inadvertently created a more earnest pipeline of sorts. People constantly made fun of how weak and thin-skinned the SJWs were. Snowflakes, they were constantly called. It turned into a cottage industry. When Anita Sarkeesian uploaded a video, for example, it was like a gold rush. Anti-SJWs would download the video, tear it apart, make fun of it, criticize it, re-upload it, and collect the ad rev. It was almost like a race. And that process was repeated for all sorts of people deemed SJW. The people advocating for SJW causes were essentially funding their own opposition. The cameras turned to college campuses, where there were plenty of young people who were excited about fighting back against racism and sexism, and because they were young, maybe they weren't the best at expressing themselves, and maybe they did not realize that their own emotion and passion was the lifeblood of the comedic skits that would use them as punchlines. I have no doubt that entire mortgages have been paid off just from making fun of college kids. And so the anti-SJW movement grew into a juggernaut, starting out as just purely a comedic response, trolling and mocking, but then gradually morphed into something very serious and political, an actual movement. The unserious, racist, and sexist jokes morphed into sincerely held beliefs and political stances. And I noticed that those who spoke out against the obsessive were becoming quite obsessive themselves. You are what you hate. Donald Trump was very much a centerpiece of that backlash. He came up during a very unique moment of the political history of the United States. Conventional wisdom regarding political correctness went right out the window. The stage at that time was set in such a way that a lot of people didn't care how offensive Trump was. They were tired of the offense takers and even wanted him to be as offensive as possible, just as a fuck you. Essentially, that is what became fashionable, be offensive. Of course, there were a lot of people who were still highly disturbed by Trump, but not enough to keep him from being elected. And that was a mandate against political correctness. It was pretty much explicit permission, and other politicians got the message loud and clear. That was the beginning of the turning point for me, though I never voted for Trump. In 2016, after he won, I was one of the people telling others to calm down, that it wasn't a big deal, don't overreact. I admit that I even did some partaking in making fun of people who were very upset about the Trump victory, and I am not proud of that. Afterward, everything kicked into high gear. The anti-SJW content went on steroids. Feminist-owned compilations became super popular, owning college kids. Every debate had to be about some SJW getting utterly destroyed, all caps. The internet was totally saturated with content mercilessly mocking anyone who even mentioned anything about racism or sexism. Anyone who would do such a thing was accused of virtue signaling and slapped with the SJW or woke label. The term woke was starting to get used more at this point. It was becoming mainstream. Even politicians and old ladies were using the word woke in their many complaints. And I started seeing some signs that disturbed me very much. Everything was being highly exaggerated, and the jokes and the comedy gradually shifted into the realm of anger and hatred. The anti-SJWs took on the obsessive nature of the people they criticized and adopted it for themselves. Entirely unintentionally, I'm sure, because if they could actually see themselves objectively, I don't think they would like what they saw, and that is, of course, a lack of self-awareness. See, now it wasn't a movement about just merely getting offended about something they happened to see or hear. It was a movement that actively sought out offense to point at, like they actively desired to be offended. No longer was it a movement about laughing at anger, it was a movement about getting angry. Suddenly the rule that inspired "you mad, brah" no longer applied. The rules changed when the offense changed. Now the winner was whoever could get the most angry. But that was still a double standard. If the other side got angry, it was still funny and mocked. But if your side got angry, it was based and applauded. Consider this woman. You've all seen this image. This is the face of a billion thumbnails, still used on uploads and memes to this day. Have you ever seen the source material? It's quite short.
There's not rapists coming into just because they're refugees doesn't mean they're fucking rapists. But they're raping people in Germany. My parents are immigrants. My fucking parents are immigrants. No, not even a fucking big percentage. Tiny.
You know how many women in the U.S.
get raped? Do you know how many?
1 in every 3
Fuck
women.
ton, a
That
fuck
means
ton.
that all Americans.
That's
are
a crisis. There's a rape crisis. Exactly.
But if you look at what a lot of the rapes that are being reported, that is not a fact. I gotta show you.
I love you all. I want you all. I love you all. I love you all.
This woman did not get triggered or belligerent or even a fraction as excited or angry as any one of us has ever been before. If you look at the comments section, you'll see that everyone openly realizes it and admits it and feels bad for how she was immortalized. She was the only one in the argument actually offering statistics rather than emotions. But there's one frame in which she made a funny face. Now, her entire existence is encapsulated by that. That's how absurd the anti-SJW movement became when they sought offense. Even a single frame was enough for them to latch onto, was enough for them to convict and condemn you. Suddenly, around them, you had to walk upon the thinnest of eggshells. What's especially funny about this meme is that the source material originally came from the Alex Jones channel, and we all know how calm and collected Alex Jones is. The anti-woke had become obsessive, hypocritical, lacked self-awareness, and incredibly easily offended. Today, the Anita Sarkeesian business model is extremely successful in the opposite direction. She became the model for the very people who hated her guts. Now we have reverse Sarkeesian media critics who consume movies and video games with the objective to actively seek out whatever in them can be construed as being woke. And they are legion: the critical drinker, nerdrotic, the quartering, heel versus babyface, etc., are all reverse Sarkeesians, but far more fanatical than she ever was. They can't simply enjoy a movie or video game for what it is. No, they have to actively examine it through an anti-woke magnifying glass to determine if someone is black who should not be black, to determine if a woman is being portrayed in a role that has deviated too far from their traditional expectations, to determine if someone said or did something that was just too gay, because that would be pushing an agenda, which they call the message. Now it's all about deconstructing media with a fine-toothed comb to uncover any little detail that could possibly be used as red meat for a voracious anti-woke audience. Offense perfected. And they can be as triggered as they want to be. See, that's the double standard. This woman cannot afford to make a single frame of a funny face without her expression being immortalized in a billion thumbnails. But this guy can literally scream at the camera for 15 minutes because an RPG asked the preferred pronoun for his character. And he even uses her face in his thumbnails. Hypocrisy perfected. This woman is quite routinely mocked. Another face of a billion memes and thumbnails, 5 seconds or so of uncontrolled despair about the President of the United States, a topic of actual consequence. But 15 minutes of even more rage over a pronoun in a video game. And the same people call it based. In 2015, on my alternate channel called Dark Antics, I made a satire critiquing the shallowness of social justice media criticism. It even picked up some traction in the mainstream media like The Independent. Basically, I used the format of nitpicking media that presented bald people in a negative light. This was as easy as pointing out all the many bad or evil characters who were bald, and pointing out the flaws of good characters who were bald. This was exceptionally easy to do, essentially a heads I win, tails you lose way of doing things. So no matter what narrative you want to push, You can use it to shoehorn perceived problems into virtually any movie. Now, in the description, I called it a criticism of how professional victims critique media. But notice that I never privated that video like I did with my popular anti-SJW cartoon. Why? Well, because today, now, that video perfectly applies to the anti-woke. What happened is that they became what they hated. The anti-woke became the woke, or at least their own characterization of what the woke is. But it's even worse than that. The anti-woke perfected being their own characterization of woke, turned it into a standardized business model even. Even their own slogan, "Get woke, go broke," is tacit admission. They took what Anita Sarkeesian pioneered and perfected it in the opposite direction. Now we have grown men with beards wearing flannel shirts, making millions of dollars, obsessively scrutinizing the development of the next Snow White movie. Grown men actively, earnestly seeking ways to be triggered by a Barbie movie. Ben Shapiro created a right-wing media empire, and yet there he is with the rest of them, burning Barbie dolls like a lunatic. This grown man with children had a camera set up in front of a metal garbage can so that he could do a toy-burning performance. It's literally performative outrage, the epitome of professional victimhood. They're so far in that they have no idea how embarrassing they are, how cringe they are. It's gotten to the point that a Fox News-addled 80-year-old can be more concerned about the wokes than about losing their social security. And lately, more and more, I'm thinking that's by design. As I observed this massive transition, I realized that it was not wokeness that I disliked. It was obsessive behavior and having to walk on eggshells around people. And obsessive behavior is not exclusive to wokeness, nor is it even a requisite of it. Right now, today, the anti-woke behaves 100 times more like the woke than the woke used to. Right now, today, I self-censor more when I talk to someone I consider anti-woke than someone I consider woke. I have to eliminate entire words from my vocabulary, like cis, or privilege, or patriarchy, or transphobic, and a million other words, because I know it will trigger a defense response that will completely shut down their ability to listen to what I actually say, or have a good faith conversation at all. And I learned that from experience. An especially potent drug of the anti-woke is trans people. I don't really understand why, but when some people start being critical of trans people, they never stop. It's addictive to them. It snowballs and eventually becomes their entire personality. Obsessive. It's really sad to see. I think there have been people who have done that with Donald Trump, in which they talk about nothing else except Donald Trump. So they were accused of having Trump derangement syndrome. Of course, that term is thrown around too loosely now to describe anyone who merely criticizes him, which is ridiculous. But originally, it was meant to describe people who were obsessed with Donald Trump, people who would bring him up out of the blue when nobody else was talking about him. And I think that concept now perfectly applies to people who get lost in anti-trans rhetoric. They have trans derangement syndrome. No matter the topic, they'll bring up trans people. They'll ask you, what is a woman? Out of the blue. Trans people are constantly on their minds, obsessive. The most prominent of these people is J.K. Rowling. obsession with trans people seems to be very detrimental to her mental health, to the point in which it's 90% of what she talks about now. But before that, she was a normal person who experienced a wonderful dream of writing a successful series of novels that were beloved worldwide and became classic movies. She was a cultural icon and was basically given a blank page to write whatever she wanted and have a massive, highly enthusiastic audience for it. But what did she do instead? She became obsessed with the steady dopamine drip of anti-trans Twitter. It's sort of like watching an Olympic gold medalist destroy their body with crack cocaine. I gradually realized that I don't have a problem with woke people. They're just people with opinions like anyone else, and they may be opinions with which I agree or disagree. No big deal. But what I do have a problem with is obsession. And what I learned was that woke people were being unjustly portrayed solely as the obsessive ones. And that's far from the truth. What anti-woke critics often tell you is that they're all sick and tired of politics being inserted into everything. But politics has been a major part of art throughout all of history. What they really mean is that they only want their preferred politics to be portrayed. It's even worse if one of the things that defines you is seen as political. Because then, how could you possibly have anything to do with art without someone accusing you of making it political? Suddenly, it's political to have an interracial relationship in a movie, or political if someone who is gay is in a video game. The word political just becomes proxy for bigotry. Oh, I don't like politics in my media. Oh, what's politics? Well, black people, gay people, strong independent women, etc. Oh, see, the word political is doing a lot of work there, isn't it? You want to be a bigot, but you don't want to be seen as a bigot. They want their cake and they want to eat it too, you see. Remember when I said that my mere existence as a non-believer offended religious people? Well, it turns out that I wasn't alone. The existence of all kinds of other people can be considered quite offensive and quite triggering if they dare to set foot out of the closet and into any sort of popular media. Let's do a little thought experiment. 2 movies directed by James Cameron are extremely beloved and quite unique because they are sequels to classics, and it is widely accepted that unlike most sequels, not only did he respect the source material, but many would argue that he actually improved upon it. And those 2 movies are, of course, Terminator 2 and Aliens. Now, I very much enjoyed both of those movies, and so did most other people who watched them. I saw them both in the theaters on the first day they were released. And to many of us, they were a major part of our childhoods, and for that reason, they get grandfathered in to the anti-woke movement so that they are off limits. They are even used as the quintessential go-to examples that anti-woke critics will use to show how women protagonists should be done, and that they are not bigots after all, because they also enjoyed those movies. But imagine if either one of those movies came out now. It's a very different climate now. And those movies would be prime material to be deconstructed by anti-woke critics, which essentially can be done to literally any movie, because it's just shallow ideological offense hunting. You see, Ellen Ripley and Sarah Connor are essentially the exact same person, with the exact same character arc. They both started out as vulnerable women in horror movies being hunted by a seemingly unstoppable monster. And then, in their sequels, they both become iconic badasses protecting their children, fighting back against the monsters in action-oriented movies. Now, as an anti-woke critic, you might say that they both transitioned from women to men. And this would no doubt be part of some nefarious woke agenda. Maybe you could even mention something about Yuri Bezmenov. Now, how would these movies be broken down by an anti-woke critic if they came out today? Well, look at Sarah Connor. She went from being a classically feminine woman desired by the man who came to save her to a ripped, masculine woman who fights like a man. In the first movie, she knew her place.
Do exactly what I say. Exactly. Don't move unless I say. Don't make a sound unless I say. Do you understand?
But in the second movie, she's the one giving the men orders.
Shut up! Shut up! Shut up! Shut up! I'm not gonna let you do it.
I need clothes, food, and one of your trucks.
Hey, how about the feelings out of my fucking teeth?
Now, Enrique.
Look at Ellen Ripley, an attractive young woman who stood no chance against a single alien that killed the entire crew of her ship, someone who the camera did not shy away from when it came to seeing her feminine body. But in the second movie, with zero training, she managed to out-survive and outgun an entire elite Marine platoon who all died except for the one corporal who needed her to save him. They chopped off all her hair and dropped her into a world where the women wear men's suits and have more muscles than the men do. In the first movie, the Terminator was badass, but in the second movie, they turned him into a punchline, no doubt an influence of the woke MCU. What would they say about the man who was most directly responsible for the development of Skynet, and hence the nuclear holocaust? Oh, Miles Bennett Dyson, an obvious DEI hire? No wonder Skynet happened. And what's this? John Connor is a juvenile delinquent and ends up in a foster home with shitty parents, all white people? While Dyson has a fully intact, happy nuclear family, obvious Hollywood propaganda. The first time the colonial Marines encounter the aliens, it's a slaughter. But who saves them? Gorman, a lieutenant of the Marines? No, of course not. He naturally panics and freezes. But Ripley, the invincible Mary Sue, takes control, charges in, and saves everybody. Wait a minute, what did I call them, by the way? Colonial Marines? You mean colonizers, right? And what happens to them? They all get killed. Yet another obvious heavy-handed Hollywood message: kill the colonizers. And what's the main reason they all die? Well, they got stranded. How'd they get stranded? Their dropship crashed. Who was piloting their dropship? DEI hire, that's who. And how was Sarah and the gang able to get past security of Cyberdyne Systems? DEI hire. In the first movie, Sarah did nothing but run and hide, but now she fights like a man and beats up only men. But I'm sure that isn't part of some woke agenda, right, Hollywood? By the way, Sarah Connor wasn't the only one who transitioned from female to male in Terminator 2. See, the first Terminator was very obviously male. But the new modern woke Terminator, it literally transitions from female to male right before our very eyes, multiple times. Is it male? Is it female? Neither? Both? Apparently, it's what the wokes call gender fluid. Wait a minute. Liquid metal? Gender fluid? The Hollywood message is at it again. And when it transitions into a man, it's not just any man, but a cop. multiple different cops. Of course, they have to play into the ACAB narrative by presenting the cop as the bad guy, spitting in the face of the classic first movie where the cops were the good guys, but now they're the bad guys. And where does Sarah and John Connor find help from this unstoppable cop? Well, with a bunch of illegals, of course. They're helpless without the illegals who supply them with plenty of illegal guns to fight against the invincible cop. Just try to be a little more heavy-handed with the message, Hollywood. We're not getting it yet. And what's the true nature of the aliens anyway? Why are they such formidable opponents? Well, all the aliens you actually see are just lowly male drones serving a queen. That's right, in the first movie, the alien was a Sigma male, but in the second movie, it's a matriarchy.
There's like one female that runs the whole show.
Yes, the queen.
Yeah, the mama. She's badass, man. I mean big.
Ripley charges in and starts aborting all the unborn aliens, which of course triggers the Queen, who chases after Ripley. And how does she end up defeating the Queen anyway? Oh, that's right. Remember that scene where she proves that a woman can use a loader better than the men, the well-trained Marine men, who have no choice but to protect their fragile egos by laughing at her? Well, that's what she uses to face the Queen, a strong black female.
She knew. And nobody believed her.
Now, I could go on and on and on and on, but clearly the point is that the timeless classics Alien and Terminator were bastardized by woke Hollywood sequels nobody asked for. All right, that's enough. You get the idea. It's analysis that's so shallow, you can literally invent offense into anything you want and then claim it's part of some nefarious agenda. It's so insufferable when someone uses their own obsessive ideology to drive their criticism of something. Now, if you don't want an agenda-driven critique of movies in either direction, you can look to someone like a Jeremy Jahns or a Red Letter Media to give a more objective and knowledgeable critique of movies, but not the people who are constantly on the hunt for wokeism so that they can feed outrage to their audiences. You know who they are. And that's their purpose. It isn't to provide you with any insight about whether you would like or dislike a movie or game. It's to provide you with anger. Anger sells. Anger gets clicks. Outrage. The objective is now to make you mad, brah. And by the old standard, they're owning their own audiences, and their own audiences don't even realize it. So, yeah, 10 years ago, I jumped on that anti-woke bandwagon ever so briefly before I realized what it actually was, an obsessive, hypocritical ideology that was rooted in demographic hatred. Much respect to the people who never jumped on board that bandwagon. You were way ahead of the curve. Now, if you were on it until more recently, well, at least you found your way off eventually. It takes a lot of integrity to admit when you're wrong, especially after being wrong for several years. We should always be willing to forgive and welcome. Now, if you're still on that bandwagon, what the fuck are you doing? Get your shit together. Now we even have people who were prominent atheists like Sam Harris and Richard Dawkins and Ayaan Hirsi Ali crying about the wokeness boogeyman to the point that some of them are even claiming to be culturally Christian or even outright fully Christian now. That's how shallow the nature of this beast has become. But why Christianity? Well, because they're not buying into real Christianity, the Christianity of Jesus Christ, which is very woke and concerned with the downtrodden and marginalized. They're buying into the modern, commercialized, propagandized, far-right version of Christianity because they think it's a bulwark against wokeness. It's really sad to see. It's like watching a starving person voraciously eat poison.